Most people are terrified of the basement. The damp earth, the concrete walls, the descent into the ground, but they have it backward. The basement is just a hole. The attic is a canopy. It hovers directly over you while you sleep. It holds the dead air of the house, and sometimes it holds things that refuse to leave. When I was a child, our attic was a labyrinth. It wasn't a cramped crawl space where you had to duck to avoid fiberglass insulation. It was massive, but it was partitioned by heavy, uneven support beams and sudden drops in elevation. You could never stand in one corner and see the other. It started on a Tuesday in middle school. I woke up, threw off the covers, and looked down. My feet were coated in a thick gray grime. There was a fine grit wedged between my toes. I hadn't been outside. I had gone to sleep in clean sheets. I washed my feet in the tub, chalking it up to some bizarre childhood anomaly, and went to school. 3 days later, I woke up to find a heavy cardboard box sitting in the center of my bedroom rug. It was filled with sepia-toned family portraits. I recognized it. It belonged in the deepest corner of the attic. I asked my mother why she put it there. She looked at me blankly and said she assumed I had brought it down. The next week, an ugly, tarnished brass lamp appeared on my desk. I was sleepwalking, but I wasn't just wandering the halls. I was navigating a treacherous, splintered maze of wooden beams in absolute pitch black, unconscious, and carrying heavy objects down a precarious drop-down ladder. The realization didn't hit me with a jump scare. It was a slow, creeping rot in my stomach. I was entirely vulnerable. I started fighting sleep. I would lay rigid in the dark, eyes wide, terrified of the moment I would slip under, knowing my body would hijack itself and march up into that oppressive space. Then came the night I didn't wake up in my bed. I opened my eyes and there was nothing. No moonlight, no outline of a door, complete sensory deprivation. And I wasn't lying down. I was standing upright. The cold hit me first, seeping through my thin pajamas, then the smell, stale dust and dried wood. I was in the attic. Panic seized my chest so tightly I couldn't draw breath. I was stranded in the middle of the maze, completely blind. One wrong step meant plunging through the drywall ceiling or shattering my ankle on an unseen joist. I stood frozen. Tears streamed down my face, hot and silent. I was too terrified to make a sound. I felt a heavy, suffocating pressure in the air, the undeniable primal instinct that told me I was not alone. Thump. It was soft, deliberate. Coming from the shadows about 10 feet behind me, it sounded exactly like someone slowly shifting their weight onto a creaky floorboard. I forced my frozen legs to move. I shuffled blindly, hands outstretched, scraping against the rough timber. Thump. Closer this time, from a different angle. Whatever was up there with me was repositioning, waiting. I don't know how I found the hatch, pure survival instinct. I dropped down the ladder, ran to my parents' room, and collapsed in hysterics. I begged my father to go up there. I told him someone was in the dark. He reluctantly grabbed a flashlight and climbed up. 2 minutes later, he came down. Nothing. Empty. The sleepwalking stopped after that night. We put a lock on the hatch, but logic has never comforted me. Sleepwalking is a medical condition, sure, but it doesn't explain how I navigated that death trap in the dark without a single scratch. It doesn't explain the footsteps. I am convinced to this day that I didn't wander up there on my own. Something pulled me up there. And that night, I woke up just before it could do whatever it was planning to do. Sometimes the threat isn't a presence that wanders. Sometimes it's something baked into the bones of the house itself. I was 15, living in an old generational estate passed down through my father's family. It was late November, and I drew the short straw, fetched the holiday decorations from the attic, My dad gave me a rapid-fire list of instructions on where things were stored. I didn't listen. I climbed the ladder, pulled the chain for the single hanging bulb, and immediately realized I had no idea what boxes to grab. I spent 20 minutes tearing the attic apart, opening sealed bins, shifting heavy furniture. I made a massive mess, finally located the lights, and hauled them down. Before closing the hatch, I went back up to survey the damage. I knew my dad would make me reorganize it. Tucked deep in a back corner, exposed only because I had moved a massive wardrobe, was a black, fireproof document box. It looked ancient, heavy-duty, and completely out of place. I popped the latch. It was crammed to the brim with loose papers, bound notebooks, hand-drawn schematics, and sheet music. Every single inch of paper was violently covered in erratic, smeared handwriting. I sat on the dusty floorboards and started reading. The early entries were mundane: grocery lists, weather observations. It was a journal from a previous owner, but as the pages progressed, the handwriting degraded. The letters became sharp, frantic, pressing so hard the pen had torn the paper. The writer had become utterly obsessed with the attic. They were taking daily measurements of the floor space, comparing it to the square footage of the rooms directly below. "The math is wrong," one entry read. "The house is smaller on the inside. The east wall is lying." They documented a void, a stretch of space several feet deep that existed behind the east wall of the attic but couldn't be accessed. The writer began spending their nights up here. The entries devolved into timestamps. 2:14 a.m. scratching again. 3 minutes it wants out. 3:40 a.m. heavy breathing behind the plaster. The final pages abandoned words entirely. They were just chaotic rows of tally marks, thousands of them, counting something the writer never named. Then, nothing. A cold sweat broke out on my neck. I slowly turned my head toward the east wall, the one the writer had fixated on. I stood up and walked over. The plaster was old, but when I looked closely, I saw them. Faint, desperate gouges at the baseboards, like someone had been clawing at the wood until their fingernails broke. I grabbed the black box and scrambled down the ladder. I slammed it onto the kitchen table in front of my dad. He looked bewildered. He didn't recognize the handwriting. It didn't belong to my grandfather, which meant it belonged to whoever built or owned the house long before my family took possession. I showed him the schematics. To my shock, he grabbed a crowbar from the garage and marched upstairs. He didn't say a word. He just walked up to the east wall and drove the iron bar straight through the plaster. He ripped down chunks of drywall. Dust filled the air, choking us. The journal was right. There was a massive void behind the wall. A hidden room spanning the entire length of the house, nearly 5 feet deep. My dad shined his flashlight into the dark. The beam hit the back wall of the hidden space, and my stomach dropped. The walls weren't bare wood. They were completely covered in thick black markings. Not letters, not words. Bizarre, jagged symbols and geometric shapes overlapping each other in a dizzying, sickening pattern. They covered the floor, the ceiling, the support beams. But the most horrifying detail wasn't the symbols. It was the architecture. We checked every inch of that void. There were no doors, no windows, no trapdoors in the floor. The space had been sealed off entirely from the outside when the house was built. So how did whoever drew those symbols get inside to paint them? We stood there in absolute silence. Then my dad pointed out a devastating piece of logic. The person who wrote those journals, the paranoid, psychotic tenant clawing at the walls, would never have neatly organized their manic writings into a pristine, fireproof box and tucked it away in a corner. Someone else found those journals. Someone else boxed them up to hide them. My grandfather. He knew what was up there. He hid the box and he went to his grave without ever telling my father what lived inside the walls of his own home. My dad patched the wall the next day. We never spoke of it again. The house was sold years later, but somewhere behind fresh drywall that room is still waiting. The things we leave in the dark have a way of waking up when we aren't looking. I've been a smoker for 23 years. It's a quiet, lonely ritual. I inherited a massive 3-story colonial from my parents 4 years ago. I live entirely alone. The house sits on an acre of land backing up to thick, dense woods. Every night around midnight I walk the perimeter of the property while I smoke. It's dead quiet. Just me, the crickets, and the glow of my cherry. The house has a tiny, slit-like window at the very peak of the roof, looking out from the attic. I've glanced up at it 1,000 times. It's always a dead, black rectangle. 3 weeks ago, I was halfway through my nightly walk. I exhaled a cloud of smoke, looked up at the roofline and froze. There was movement behind the glass. Not a shadow cast by the trees, not a trick of the moonlight. A solid, heavy shape shifted past the narrow pane. It eclipsed the ambient darkness for a split second, then vanished. I dropped my cigarette. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at the window for 5 straight minutes, but it remained still. I tried to rationalize it. A bat. A massive raccoon. I went inside, locked the doors, and stood at the bottom of the stairs, straining my ears toward the 3rd floor. Silence. The house is ancient. The floorboards groan if you even shift your weight. Nothing was moving. The next night I did my walk. I didn't want to look up, but human nature is a curse. I looked. The shape was there again, pressing against the glass. I couldn't ignore it anymore. If raccoons were breeding up there, they would destroy the wiring. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and pulled down the heavy wooden ladder in the upstairs hallway. Climbing into a dark attic is a profound exercise in vulnerability. Your head breaches the floor before your hands can defend you. I crested the opening and swept my flashlight across the gloom. The attic was completely destroyed. Every cardboard box was gutted. Heavy wooden trunks were flipped upside down. The contents of my family's history were shredded and scattered like refuse. But I didn't care about the mess. My light hit the walls, and I stopped breathing. Thick, viscous black paint was smeared across every vertical surface. It was smeared on the drywall, the brick chimney stack, the sloping ceiling. It was heavy, chunky, and applied with massive, erratic strokes. And it was wet. It was actively dripping down the walls, pooling softly on the floorboards. It looked like it had been violently slathered on just seconds before I climbed up. Bile rose in my throat. I flashed my light frantically into the corners. Empty. I practically fell down the ladder, my mind spinning with pure, unadulterated panic. A squatter, a lunatic, was living in my house. I hit the 2nd floor landing. Adrenaline mutated my fear into boiling rage. This was my home. I sprinted to the kitchen, grabbed a heavy 8-inch chef's knife, and marched back to the base of the ladder. Then I heard it, thump, thump, followed by the agonizing sound of something heavy being slowly dragged across the attic floor directly above my head. I lost my mind. I screamed at the top of my lungs, a feral, terrifying sound, and charged up the ladder, brandishing the knife. I burst into the attic, ready to kill or be killed. "Get out!" I roared, sweeping the flashlight wildly. Nothing. The attic was completely devoid of life. There were no hidden corners, nowhere to tuck away. I stood alone in the center of the wreckage, panting, the knife trembling in my grip. Then I saw the walls again. The wet black paint was still there, but layered over it, cutting deep through the drywall and into the structural wooden beams beneath, were fresh scratch marks. Massive parallel gouges, as if a creature with iron claws had thrown a tantrum against the walls. Wood splinters littered the floor. I ran. I locked myself in the downstairs bathroom and dialed 911. The police arrived, drew their weapons and cleared the house. 2 officers spent 20 minutes in the attic. They came down, looking confused. "It's empty," the sergeant told me. "No sign of forced entry, no gaps in the roof, no secret panels." I screamed at him. I told him I heard the dragging. I told him the paint was wet. They shrugged, took a report for vandalism, and left me alone in the house. It's been 3 weeks. I haven't slept in my bedroom. I sleep on the living room couch with all the lights on. The police think a homeless person snuck in and slipped out a window, but they don't understand the physics of this house. The floors scream if you breathe on them. Nobody walked down those stairs. Nobody opened a window. Whatever smeared that black slop on my walls, whatever dragged itself across the floor while I stood at the bottom of the ladder, it didn't leave. It's still up there, waiting in the dark.